Good afternoon and welcome everyone joining us live. My name is Salih Hudayar. I'm the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the East Turkistan government in exile. Normally, our program is hosted by our Minister of Communications and Information, Dr. Juret Obul, but today I have the honor of hosting the 88th episode of Searching on the Path of Independence. And so wherever you are watching from, whether that's YouTube, Facebook, X, or any other platforms, I'm glad you're here. And because today's conversation or today's episode is one that you definitely need to hear. Before I introduce our guest, I want to say this directly because what we are discussing today is not politics. It's not a matter of perspective. It is mass murder. It is the systematic killing of the East Turkistani people, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other Turkic peoples in East Turkestan, not only through imprisonment, torture, and cultural destruction, but through the literal harvesting of their organs in many cases, while they're still alive. And this is among the most horrific crimes being committed anywhere on earth today, and it is largely happening in silence. And today, our guest today has spent years refusing to allow that silence to stand. So I'd like to introduce Ethan Gutmann, who is our guest speaker today. And Ethan Gutmann is a China analyst, a human rights investigator, and a senior research fellow in China studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He's also the co-founder of the International Coalition to End Transport Abuse in China, and his work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, the Weekly Standard, Investors Business Daily, among numerous other global media and platforms. He has briefed the United States Congress, various U.S. government agencies, the European Parliament, the United Nations, and he has testified before bodies in London, Ottawa, Canberra, Dublin, Edinburgh, Prague, and Jerusalem. He's also a former policy analyst at the Brookings Institute, and he has appeared again numerous times on PBS, CNN, BBC, CNBC, among other media across the world. And in 2017, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. His first book, Losing the New China, which was published in 2004, broke ground on China's surveillance state and its intersection with Western business. His 2014 book, The Slaughter, exposes China's organ harvesting of political prisoners and dissidents. And in 2016, he co-authored the landmark investigative report, Bloody Harvest, The Slaughter, and Update, which systematically examined the transplant programs of hundreds of hospitals across China. And now, on March 10th of this year, Ethan Gutmann has published his most important and most urgent work yet, the Xinjiang Procedure, based on his personal on-the-ground investigative interviews with Uyghur and other Kazakh survivors and refugees across Central Asia, as well as other investigative work that he carried out in Central Asia. So it is a book that is about what is being done to the East Turkistani people. It is a book that names the crimes, traces the systems, and demands a response from the international community. You can find the Xinjiang Procedure on Amazon, and the link we have included in the description and the comments below. So we encourage you to grab a copy, share it, and make sure that you read it and that others read it. So with that, excuse me for the long introduction. Ethan, thank you for your tireless work, for your continued moral courage, and for joining us live today. And welcome to the episode of Searching on the Path of Independence.
Great to be here. Thank you very much.
So, Ethan, let's start from the beginning. Your book right here is called The Xinjiang Procedure. So why did you choose that title, and what does it mean?
Well, actually, I mean, it was a bit of a controversial title for me personally, because I'm perfectly aware, as somebody who lived in China for 3 or 4 years, that Xinjiang is a Chinese word which basically means new territory, and it's very insulting to uh, potential citizens of independent East Turkestan. However, we live in a world where I am trying to reach all kinds of readers, and you know, it's I don't like to get stuck on language too much. All right, in this case, and so I chose to go ahead with the Xinjiang Procedure as the title. I've used that title before, and it was popular because people could recognize. A lot of people do recognize the word Xinjiang and know what it means and what it suggests. There's another aspect, one more aspect to that. You know, when I'm writing about something like the Xinjiang Procedure, which is really a reference to, it's a made up reference. I made it up myself. And I've never heard the phrase really in Chinese. It's just something I came up with because the evidence is that the first place where live organ harvesting was carried out was actually in East Turkestan. And you see, even there, I feel uncomfortable using the term East Turkestan for something that's so heinous a crime. I mean, this is uh, it's the Uyghurs are not responsible for this. This is Han Chinese responsibility. It's the Communist Party responsibility. So I think it's important to kind of separate that out. The Xinjiang Procedure refers to the live organ harvesting of political and racial groups. Okay, I mean, this is not just an ethnicity question. There's a race aspect to it as well. And I don't like to separate that in. I don't like to put that in, the East Turkestan procedure. That is not. You see what I mean? It was a kind of a dilemma, that I had, with the title. But I do mention that's the first thing I say in the book. There's no introduction to the book. There's just an author's note, and it says I'm using the word. This is a reader-friendly book. I'm using the word Xinjiang. Instead of East Turkestan. I understand what the implications of that are. I also use the terms Eastern and Western. I mean, my wife is a kind of standard issue academic these days, sort of said, "Hey, you can't use that because these are constructs." And I'm just like, look, when I mean Western, I'm talking about democracies, both Western and Eastern. That is my shorthand that I'm using. This is user friendly. It's I do get into the difference between the words, and particularly very much at the end, and what I call the afterword in the book, when I get into the actual issues of Uyghur independence. And I take a very strong stand on
Okay,
that
and
compared to
if we
most of
can,
my colleagues. So, yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Sylvie.
I apologize for interrupting you. I think we have a little bit of a connection issue, but it was kind of cutting out, but I think now it's better. So if we can move on to the second question because of time. The book opens with a chapter called "Don't Cry, Ruqya." So could you tell us who Ruqya is and why did you?
The reader out there, when I imagine, especially living in England, I started this book living in London, and I had this feeling that the average reader out there is very similar to the kind of the BBC. They don't really accept a lot of these things as being true. There's a kind of unreality about the world in England and Scotland and Wales today. Uh, I wanted to punch them in the gut. Her story is a remarkable story, Rukia Perhat's story. Not just because she was tortured and raped and sort of everything you can kind of imagine was thrown at her. Public rape, everything you can imagine. But she also came from a separatist family. separatist Uyghur family. In fact, her whole family was killed in front of her, one at a time over the years. The title itself, "Don't Cry, Rukia," was her younger brother, or the one who was closest to her, 4 years apart from her. Just before the firing squad opened up on him, he screamed that out. "Don't cry, Rukia." It's a very effective title for that reason. She is a remarkable character. She never gave in. She refused to sign anything. She fought and fought, and she says she calls herself a living shaheed, and I think that's very true. And I hope that it's a 20,000-word chapter, and I hope by writing this chapter, I've allowed her to. Maybe it's the best. Maybe she's fulfilled her mission. I hope so. There's some talk of maybe even getting her to congressional testimony later on this summer.
Thank you. Could you, in part of the book, you talk about her refusal to, give in, to give up, and to, essentially submit to what the Chinese state wants. And in it, she has a compelling statement that she makes. Could you share that statement that she makes with our audience?
Well, she basically says that if you can kill me, but there will be 1,000 Rukias born. She says that if there's you should not be so proud. You can kill us, you can torture us, but we have a saying, and I'm sure I'm going to botch this because I'm not really looking at the actual saying of the way it was translated, but that underneath, say, 7 layers of earth, the truth is still there and will be ultimately uncovered. She never gave. That was just before they put her in the final stage of her torment, which was to move her to water torture, which is a kind of slow-acting poison. You have to struggle. You're lowered into this vat of water and its chemicals and human waste and so forth, and there's all these pathogens floating through the water. And over time, you have to struggle to keep your breath, keep your head above the water. So she was just doing that about 3 or 4 hours a day. And after a couple of months of this, your body gets very puffy. This used to happen to Falun Gong practitioners too. So I've heard the same descriptions in a completely different language, both in Han Chinese and also in Uyghur. And your skin gets very puffy and starts to just rot. And essentially, they thought basically she was dead. Her aunt intervened and was able to bribe the guards to get her body, but she was just barely breathing, to a hospital. And after 2 months of nothing, just breathing, she started to see things again. And then it took another 6 months before she started recognizing human beings. Look, if I sound emotional, it's because her story still very much touches me. It was very touching at the time. I did it with Rahima Mahmoud, was the translator. And the two of us both had nightmares from her descriptions of the camps. And I think the most striking thing was that we had no way to verify her story. So at the very end, I took a walk. This was when she moved to Germany. We originally interviewed her in Istanbul. And she moved to immigrant housing in Germany, in a sort of far off town. And I said, look, I'm going to take a walk, and you're going to tell Rahima everything that happened to you sexually. And I said, I'm really, really sorry to do this, but if you don't do this, people will not believe your story. And the one thing that came out of that story was that she didn't know what a condom really was. And that is impossible to fake that. It's impossible if you listen to the interview, the pauses where she goes, oh my God, that's what that's for. And Rahima's explaining to her. This was the best proof we could have come up with. And it gives absolute credence to her story and absolute moral authority to everything she said. So I think it's a very important way to open the book. I mean, look, it's a question of putting the human back in human rights in these cases. You know, we do these reports. We we come out there and we try very hard to be rational and not to be leading and so forth. And I'm all for that. I like that. I like to be objective too. I don't like to yell at people or tell them how to think. But uh, but we need to really reach out and touch people sometimes to get the full impact of what's going on in this case. So that's where I'm at with it. She is just one part of the story. Now it's true that her entire family was looked at for organ harvesting when she was 12 years old. So they medical exams, extensive medical exams, and it was very clear they were looking at organ harvesting. And her mother was also sterilized during that period.
I mean, I mean, I don't want to lead you or others in the audience, but I think her story is one of many that the people of East Turkestan are facing, and we are lucky to get her story out because she is one of the few lucky survivors that have been able to, out of the millions, tens of millions that have been able to survive and share their story. That being said, I want to move on to the second chapter, which you titled Postmortem, and it centers on a doctor who you stated at the Hudson Institute the other day that just a couple of weeks back, this doctor was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Can you, if you don't mind, can you tell us that story, who this person is,
it's
what
such a
they did,
it's a
and
very complex story. Okay,
yeah.
so I'm gonna tell it as just just give you the basics on it. Basically, this was a doctor who became a witness in my last book, uh, The Slaughter. And he was a key witness because he had gone to China to try to arrange organs for his patients in Taiwan. And he made a deal with the mainland doctors, but he was concerned about the quality of the organs. And they assured him, oh, well, all the organs are coming from Falun Gong. These people, they don't drink, they don't smoke, they practice this very healthy Qigong. So don't worry about it. You're not getting prisoner organs here. No drug addiction, nothing like that. He went, this was a revelation at the time, and we were off the record. And so it took me a couple of years, but I kind of circled around, came back to him and sort of said, look, can we use this interview? And I wrote the interview up, and he agreed to the interview. But then he decided to run for mayor of Taipei. And when he did that, suddenly somebody noticed the book and translated part of it into Chinese, and he freaked out and basically said, "I didn't really say that. I didn't say anything of the kind. Actually, Ethan Gutmann, I don't know who this person is." And he went through a whole series of denials, absurd denials, and each one was contradictory to the other. And this went on for weeks. It was the front pages of every paper. Now, Falun Gong practitioners in Taiwan are in a very vulnerable position. If China invades, they will be rounded up. They will be killed. They will be organ harvested, or they'll be sent off to mental hospitals in the mainland, or so whatever. So Taiwan is their life raft, and they begged me not to tangle, not to fight with Dr. Wenjie about this. And I was getting called all kinds of names. He was calling me ridiculous things in the press and so forth. But I sat there with a fist in my stomach and did nothing. Eventually, and he won the election very handily for mayor.
Oh wow.
Okay, and he then went on. He was decent to the Falun Gong practitioners. He stopped the concentric, whatever, some Chinese cutout group, Chinese Communist Party cutout group that operates in Taiwan from taking their tables full of literature and knocking them all over, and that kind of thing. The usual is harassment at Taipei 101, a great skyscraper. Now, look, the bottom line, long story short, is the whole thing. The question is, why did he give me the interview? Well, it turns out he thought I was CIA. And he actually, the reason he thought, I don't know why he thought I was CIA, but he did. He somehow got it in his mind that I was CIA, so I knew everything about him already. And so he kind of gave me a story that I would like, but he also presented himself as a hero who was trying to stop this. It was not true. The opposite was going on. In fact, a couple of months before I'd interviewed him, he had been the only foreigner at a transplant conference in China, which had the most notorious transplant doctors in China in it, attending. And he was the only foreigner, and he was given a keynote, essentially the central position, and it was on how to use ECMO, which is an oxygenation procedure, to live organ harvest people. Okay, so that's, anyways, eventually I got into a big tangle with him while he was running for his second term. And this time I did not hold back. And I held a press conference, supposedly the second biggest press conference in Taiwanese history. And I revealed all the whole connection to ECMO and what he was doing. And that he had basically created an incentive to harvest Falun Gong, an incentive to harvest Uyghurs, Tibetans, House Christians, whatever. He'd improved he improved the potential. You could get 6 organs out of these people using this system that he had taught them. All right. What I did inadvertently, I caught the interest of something called the Control One in China, in Taiwan rather, and that is like an internal FBI which investigates government officials mainly for corruption, because the Han Chinese culture is very obsessed with corruption and people not being on the take. Anyways, they were very attracted to this story and eventually interrogated him in closed sessions on this. And he basically admitted partially to it. But once they had gotten the bit between their teeth, so to speak, they started really going after him and looking at him. And that's when apparently he made a real estate deal, or what we call a sweetheart real estate deal, which had given him about $500,000 or something like that. He'd also broken into his own, he ran for president. And he created a new party. He created a new party, and he took from the tiller on that one as well.
Okay.
I don't know how much money exactly. It's always hard to do the conversion, but he turned out to be a fairly corrupt official in every respect. He's not only a liar, which I accused him of lying about my book and so forth, and I didn't think that was such a big insult because a lot of politicians lie. It's sort of part of the job in many cases, right? But he had 3 criminal court cases against me. He was obsessed with me, and now the shoe's on the other foot. And the sad thing about it is that when he did become mayor again, but he was barely skimmed by the second time, and I do think I had something to do with that. Now, there's one other thing. Basically, at one point, he turned around while he was still mayor and obviously thinking of running for president, and started sending me emails. And he basically said, I'm interested in maybe becoming a doctor again. And it's clear that he doesn't have a medical license anymore. And it's clear that he wanted me to embrace him. And I said, I have no choice but to do that, sir. If you will only acknowledge, that you're against this, join the organization I built, or Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, or something. Do something to show that you're absolutely against this procedure. But he couldn't do that. He started negotiating immediately. What exactly do I have to say? And that is the problem. The problem was he was so blackmailed, potentially, by China. This is such a classic case of a doctor getting involved, riding the Chinese dragon, thinking everything's going to be okay. But you do so many things in China that are not on the up and up. And eventually you're in a blackmail position. He's the Manchurian candidate. He didn't get that far. He got about 25% of the vote, something like that, in the presidential election. And then he was brought to heels by the Control Yuan. So I think it's a story that has a lot of meaning going forward to medical corruption. Not about Taiwan. I don't think Taiwan's special in this area. Not really. But it does show something that, and this is kind of a recurring theme in the book, which I never come right out and say exactly, but this failure of the West. The whole failure of American society. I mean, the failure of the press, the failure of course, the human rights organizations to really take up arms on these issues. the failure of the medical community, which is only now being, changing. Now we have a schism within the transplant community, half of them saying we can't have any connection with China ever again until they fix this problem. And there's no sign they fixed it. So he is an example, and it's a sad example because he is going to prison, maybe not 17 years, maybe he'll get less ultimately, but he's going to prison, and this is his legacy. This is who he is. It's like the end of Breaking Bad or something. I mean, with the whatever, Mr. White, examining the new lab. That's how I feel about this. I think he did a terrible thing. He was the only doctor. He was the only doctor who understood how this was being used exactly and could definitely knew it. And at the same time, he was teaching the techniques anyways. Who does that?
Yeah, well, hopefully he will face justice for his complicity, his crimes. Coming back to the book, you stated you titled chapter 5 "The Perfect 28." And what is the significance of that number, and what exactly did you uncover during your investigation?
Well, I mean, to some extent, that was I've got to give some strong credit to Falun Gong practitioners who had a kind of a working group called World Organization to investigate the persecution of Falun Gong, particularly a guy named Dr. Charles Lee, who intercepted a bunch of medical files. And these were all by Chinese transplant surgeons. They had case after case where the person was pretty obviously, well, I mean, it was a lot of males and some females, and they were their organs were extracted. They were obviously killed in the process. And they were all about age 28, sometimes 29, sometimes 27, sometimes 31, 30, right in that range, but mostly, as I read it, 28. And the reason given almost universally for their death was heart failure. Now, how many people at age 28 die of heart failure? I mean, it's exceedingly rare. It's almost unthinkable. It's one of the rarest things. You're probably less likely to die of heart failure at age 28 than any other age you could be at. In fact, the reason why the transplant doctors use 28-year-olds is because your organs have stopped growing, but you're at the peak of your health. You're at the peak of health. You're just perfectly where you want to be. And I think there's a secondary reason too. I'll just mention it. If you think of activism, say within the Uyghur community, within Falun Gong, within Tibetan, 28 is the perfect age. It's where you begin to have some inklings of wisdom, and yet you are physically your brain is working very well. You're a very vital person at that age. So you are destroying the potentialities of these movements, right? You're also making a huge profit because in China is the great place to get a transplant. There's no question about it. You're more likely to get a successful transplant in China than anywhere else in the world. So what we found was this. I found this pattern of the people who went missing at 28 within the camps, the concentration camps. The people I was talking to in Kazakhstan were mainly Kazakhs who'd gotten out. They're the only people who do, as you know. So very few Uyghurs have made it out to the West. Very few. But Kazakhs have some connections. They have relatives. They have some guanxi, as they say. They have sometimes they can bribe their way across that border. It's a little porous. And they did make it out of the camp sometimes. And they did make it over to Kazakhstan. And then they hide out. And they don't really want to be bothered. But we were able to get 20 of them. I interviewed 20 of them, extensively interviewed them over a period of a couple months. And that's what I look for. I wouldn't tell them I was really looking for organ harvesting. I'd just say, did anybody disappear? I was only interested in first-hand accounts. Second-hand accounts didn't seem important to me. This is what a study is. That's the rigor I put on the study. Was these must be first-hand accounts. We're not interested in people's impressions of how many people went missing. Did somebody go missing inside your cell block? And the rate was surprisingly consistent by my standards. 2.5 to 5% went missing every year. That if you accept that there are 1 million in the camps, I think that's an underestimate. But that is 25,000 to 50,000 every year. That's what we're looking at. So it's a spectacular number. That means that since 2017 or so, we're looking at 200,000, over 200,000 dead. And these are people in prime of life. There's one more thing about the 28-year-olds. They disappear in the middle of the night. They are not, sometimes they do a daylight thing where they take them out, but you had to look at your shoes. You weren't allowed to look up or in any way acknowledge what was going on. But mostly it was done in the middle of the night. Now, that is very different from, say, young women in the camps who get sent off to do forced labor in some factory out east. They announced we made, they're going to this wonderful factory and, selling clothes or whatever, and, let's give them a little hand of applause. That would often be announced during lunch. Okay, so these are a different group. And I also made sure that they weren't being used for sexual slavery. I asked a lot of questions to establish that, and I'm convinced that nobody really was being used at that age, that they were only after young women. So these are my numbers. I absolutely stand by them.
So it's safe to say, since China, because we're coming into next month, actually, May 23rd marks the 12th anniversary of China officially launching its ongoing campaign of genocide, which it euphemistically calls the Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism, or the so-called People's War against terrorism, which initiated all of these mass internment and genocidal policies. With that, it would be safe to assume that, at least 300,000, as you mentioned, have been killed solely for their organs. We're not talking about the others that have died from other means,
No.
whether it's through torture, executions, liver failure because of tuberculosis, etc.
That's right. I mean, look, that's a very hard calculation. Mine's an easier calculation. Trying to calculate those things, the loss of life. I mean, just the amount of people I talked to when I was looking into forced labor. I mean, you can see it in certain people who men who will die very young, okay, way before their time, simply because of the working conditions that they had to operate under. Plastic jewelry and a big vat of glue constantly. These sorts of issues. So it's very hard to calculate that. We can't even calculate how many people really died of cancer prematurely because of the nuclear testing in Lac Nord back in the 60s and 70s. But I think it's very important that we try to, whenever we can, to try to establish some numbers. I think the public's owed that. I mean, there are a lot of issues out there, and a lot of terrible things take place in this world, this cruel world of ours. That if we ask them to pay attention, well, these are the numbers, okay? And what I've mainly discovered is that Falun Gong is not the main focus of organ harvesting, and has not been for some time now, not probably since 2013, 2014, when those first medical testing started in East Turkistan, where suddenly, no Han Chinese had to go, only Uyghurs. And then eventually Kazakhs as well, and Kyrgyz and so forth, also had to do this health checks. But these health checks, I didn't talk to a single person, not a single witness, and I'm including other people I talked to more peripherally about this, who said, they sort of contacted them after these health checks and said, oh, you've got high blood pressure. We really ought to look into that a little bit. Nothing. It was simply, they were in there to have a pretense of a health check, and really what they were checking was the tissue matching. They were looking at blood types. They were looking at DNA. right?
I mean, well,
And
the Chinese government itself, I believe Xinhua state media reported in 2018 that they had collected the voice prints, retina scans, and DNA samples of 36 million people between the ages of 12 and 65 in East Turkestan alone. So that clearly shows that, this is not just about, of course, they said that this was done under the free healthcare, free health checks for all program, but uh, it shows that, this is not being done for, just for the health checks. Why would you need their DNA samples? Why would you need their retina scans, their voice prints?
well, this is something I write about in the book, in one of the other chapters called "Inch by Bloody Inch," which is about really lobbying in Washington over this issue. And I think a lot of people in Washington types will find this very interesting. But one of the tangles I got into was with Human Rights Watch, with Sophie Richardson of Human Rights Watch, because they were the first ones to report in a major Western, in the West anyways, on the health checks. But they simply put down the DNA. They said, oh, well, that's, for surveillance. Because they love to talk about surveillance and invasion of privacy and so forth. But the fact is, we've known in this rarefied community which studies organ harvesting, we've known that for a long time now, the ultimate, the best way to test a human being to see if they can be compatible with another human being is to have a blood test and a DNA test, that they act as checks on each other. And if you could you could basically come up with a perfect match using those two things together. It is the brass ring. It is the ultimate in in selection of these people for organ harvesting. And so and we know that Thermo Fisher Scientific was providing those DNA tests. And these were not the fun DNA tests where it's like, oh, I'm part African. I didn't know that. These kinds of ones that are out in the web. No, this is serious stuff. This is the stuff that's used for actual tissue typing, or what we call cross matching. Okay, so yes, of course, a lot of these people are too old to be, their organs are too old and they won't be used and so forth. But what they've done is mapped out the entire Uyghur population. And it is not I mean, it may be useful for surveillance too. I don't deny that. But I honestly think this goes beyond an invasion of privacy.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
this is,
the
and,
Chinese the Chinese government earlier this year actually, the health ministry of the so-called autonomous region, or the health department of the autonomous region, made it very clear that they actually announced that they're going to triple the number of so-called organ transplant centers, which are the organ harvesting centers, by threefold by 2030, within the next few years. So this clearly shows that this systematic mass organ harvesting of the Uyghur and other Turkic peoples are still unfortunately going to continue, that the Chinese government has an intent to continue profiting off of our organs while also killing a substantial amount of our population.
that's right. And sometimes people have sort of phrased it in terms of, well, what is it? Are they trying to make money? Or are they trying to do? I'm like, you know, and that just shows their inexperience with China. It's like the Chinese Communist Party always prefers something where there's kind of a profit motive on one side and an ideological motive, and the two can work together. This is ideal. This is perfect. Okay. Uh, the fact is, you know, the Uyghurs were a natural choice. There is some evidence that, uh, there is some evidence that the China, the Falun Gong were getting long in tooth in part, but also we had raised a lot of questions about Falun Gong being harvested, and they were taking some heat for it. So when the Chinese started talking about reforming the system, the medical system, and the transplant system, they were seriously thinking about reforming, except that their reform involved moving it to Xinjiang, okay, moving it to that region, to a closed region where you could rationalize the whole thing, and you had a huge captive population, which could be tested at any time. I mean, they're constantly testing, doing blood testing within the concentration camps, constantly. And part of that is not just simply, oh, is that person still healthy? That's part of it. But there's another aspect. They want to make sure, like a car leaving the assembly line, is this the right car? Is there anything wrong with it? So there's a last minute kind of, for tissue typing, there's a last minute check. All right. So you can see there's a lot of rationality contained in this. And I suppose that's one of the most disturbing things that I found was the sense that this had become rational, and in fact that there was a kind of arrogance about it too. I mean, John Yekelix in his book, he makes more of it than I would, but he spends quite a lot of time talking about the overheard conversation between Putin and Xi, where they're both sort of talking about how they want to live to 150 and so forth. It's as if they're two very wealthy men talking about their the maintenance on their Maseratis or something. Now, some Chinese have interpreted that as kind of an advertisement for organ harvesting, and that's possible too. It's possible they knew they were going to. I don't need to get into that much. I think it just shows one thing very clearly: arrogance. There's an understanding that the West was not going to really do that much about this. Okay. That may be changing now, but that has been the assumption. And this was particularly true, within the wake of Ukraine and Gaza, where the whole world seemed to just turn away from the Uyghur situation. And from the Chinese perspective, they were home free. Now,
Yes.
maybe we're entering a new era right now. I'm hoping that's true with my book, Jan's book, Brownback's book coming out, and I expect to see a renewal of Uyghur activism. So we'll see.
So for this book, for part of your research, you actually went undercover to Central Asia, including Tajikistan. So why Tajikistan, and what specifically drew you to Tajikistan, and what did you find there?
Well, I think this was an idea that had been kicking around for a little while. The idea was to look into. Well, it was partly because the International Criminal Court, Tajikistan is a signatory. It's a very lonely country, okay, and they love to join things. It's true. It's really a feature of the country. I'm sorry. I had to plug in here. I'm going to have to sort of handhold this for a little bit.
Not a problem.
Okay, so basically, the International Criminal Court can investigate. There is precedent that they can investigate China if China is doing something in a signatory country of the International Criminal Court. Now, I have never put a lot of stock in the criminal court. I've never gone to sleep thinking, oh, thank God they're on the case. But I did have one feeling, which is that they scare the Chinese. The International Criminal Court terrifies the top Chinese Communist Party leadership because they can imagine themselves hanging from nooses, similar to the kinds of things that took place at the end of World War II, okay, with the Nazis. So I thought, well, this is an interesting way of going at it, and nobody had been on the ground in Tajikistan. So we put it together. We had very little to go on, very little leads. We had no real contacts on the ground, and we had to build them, which was very, very difficult in a country which is not known for a good electronic surveillance. It's actually rather poor at electronic surveillance, but it has excellent human surveillance. In other words, about 50% of the people you are talking to are potentially informers for the state. Might give you up for the equivalent of $50, that kind of thing. So this was a real problem. And a big shout out to my fixer translator, a Uyghur who grew up in Kazakhstan, Bobby. Bobby took incredible risks along with me, we toured the country until we finally found some witnesses who could tell us about what had happened to the Uyghurs the expats Uyghurs, the ones who dominated the bazaars of Tajikistan, and they had disappeared at a rate of almost 90%. We were able to establish this was the same pattern in Kyrgyzstan. We were able to do that in a much shorter time. But the bottom line was we were able to establish that basic point. Now there's another failure though, because when I got back and we had these results, and we kept building on them because there were some other refugees in Istanbul, who we interviewed as well. And the International Criminal Court just immediately went off and said, "Oh no, we've got to investigate Netanyahu. Maybe we'd like to investigate Trump." It's like, well, okay, that's something shiny. I understand that within the human rights world, that's very trendy. Okay, but the fact is, uh, you know, this was a signatory to the ICC, and they weren't going to do anything. This is sort of unreal to me. And frankly, the fact that let me go further. The prosecutor of the ICC currently has 3 sexual harassment cases on his back, and they sound reasonably plausible to me. I'm not there with a clipboard. I'm not a judge of these things, but it sounds reasonably plausible. It sounds like a pattern. If I had known, and not me, didn't go through so many risks. I mean, the worst that could have happened to me, I'd be questioned and maybe roughed up a little bit in a prison in Tajikistan or something. But if Bobby had been caught, a Uyghur, a Kazakh Uyghur from Kazakhstan, I don't know what could have happened. I can't believe I risked his life for something like this, for these posers in Europe to do nothing. And I frankly, they've lost all credibility with me. The America does not accept the ICC as won't accept them as a defining legal authority. I don't either. I don't think we should. This is a massive failure on the scale that I've seen with these other human rights organizations like Amnesty International and so forth. I'm sorry to say this. I know that it's but I've got to be honest. Look, I'm a writer. I'm not a politician. I can say these things, without, and I may lose some friends, but I'm not going to lose the cause. I understand that we all have to make deals in politics, but I'm very upset about the way the Tajik thing went because we
Could
put a
you
lot of time into that. Sorry, go ahead.
could you tell us about, some of the things that you discovered there? Like what
Well,
some of the key points of your discoveries in your investigation.
okay.
We also read in your book you were talking about, and there's actually photos of some Chinese military bases or facilities in the country. So could you tell us about that and how that
Well,
came
that was
out?
something that I was interested in exploring because I thought it would add to the case. Because one of the things we picked up was this sense of the Chinese presence, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth. That they've been sending people in, that the Chinese consulate had their feelers everywhere. They're constantly meeting with the Tajik police and so forth. So I spent a couple of evenings just going over Google Earth, just looking at the border between Tajikistan and China. Not too much happening there, except there was this one spot where the border comes very close together, and that's because Tajikistan had ceded a bit of land to the Chinese. Okay, it's apparently as a payment basically in lieu of a missed payment in the Belt and Road Initiative, right? One of these loans that they made and they couldn't pay back. Tajikistan couldn't pay back, so they gave up some land. And they figured nobody would care that much about it because it was just a bunch of sheep herders and so forth that would complain. In fact, yaks is the main ones who used to graze there. But there was this missing thing on the map. There was this odd, I can't even describe it to this day. It looked like as if a child had just smudged part of the map with their fingers, like clouds, but they weren't even clouds. And I said, I wonder what's behind, wonder what's there. So one of the things we did was it's very interesting how we just sort of handled the deception of going out to the Pamir Mountains. And we had a famous bike rider who was with us. And so we were able to make our way up to the Colma Pass. We're the first people to get up there in years, apparently, because it was COVID times.
Yeah.
We took pictures of the Colma Pass. And then we had established such a friendly relationship with the Tajik soldiers that we said, hey, we're going to head north. We're just going to head north. We hope the road is still open because there'd been a lot of flooding. And they said, yeah, great. And so they knew we were heading north. That means you're going along the Tajik border. Well, the Tajik borders actually kind of broken up. It's like a fence line that has breaks in it. And at one point, we reached our Jeep couldn't make it through. So we went into no man's land between Tajikistan and China, which is a very small, it's not a big piece of land up at that particular point. And as we drove along, there it was, this massive, rather large, massive base. Most of it probably underground. And we could take pictures of it, but boy, were they taking pictures of us. So they had cameras swiveling, cameras on huge platforms that were all swiveling to look at us. We drove fast, but not too fast. We took as many pictures as we could. The barbed wire fences were set up very well, and they're set up for quick movement. Now, what's interesting about this? Why would all this be there? To defend, to make sure that Uyghurs don't get out through the Coleman Pass? Yeah, well, maybe that's part of it. To make sure the Chinese don't try to go the other, the Chinese don't even try to do that, or that Tajiks don't try to come over to go to Kashgar or something. Okay, that's all possible. But the real reason is that there is 50%, it's been estimated that 50% of the world's uranium is located just 25 miles away from that base. Okay, just about 25 miles. It's so basically half the world's yellow cake is there. Now, this came up just recently at the Hudson Institute because I gave a talk, you were there, and there was a fellow from the Department of Energy, and he said, we have word that the Chinese are going to try to massively expand their nuclear arsenal. Now, I'm not there with a, I'm not there with a clipboard. I can't say, how much they're going to expand it and how much uranium deposits they have already. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that this was a precious jewel to the Soviet Union when they had Tajikistan, this uranium deposit. And these days, the Russians are very much missing in action in Central Asia. The Chinese are very much moving in. So I see the whole thing, if you want a kind of a summary of it, that what we're looking at here is the South China Sea on the west. And we're just waiting for the nine dash line to come around it. These are the biggest resources to some extent, maybe some of the biggest resources in the world in the Pamir Mountains and in Kyrgyzstan as well.
To that point, I mean, in 1936, the Chinese Ministry of Education had released a map for their children, to learn in school, called the Map of Shame, in which or a map of national shame, in which they claim precisely half of Central Asia, including much of Tajikistan, including large parts of northern large parts of like the half of Afghanistan, if not more, as part of China, as territories or ancient territories that were lost to foreign invaders, etc. So the nine dash line has already been drawn. In fact, if we know anything about the nine dash line, it was drawn in the 1930s by the Chinese nationalists, and then inherited by the Chinese communists. So it's there, and I completely agree with you. I don't think the reason that China has these bases in Tajikistan, or the reason that it's further militarizing East Turkestan is solely about the fear of Uyghurs. No, I think it's about serious potential power projection that China is planning for the future.
Yes, this was one of the most.
I think.
I agree with that, and I think this is why I've been making the claim that
connection is cutting out a little bit.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
I think I've been trying to make the claim that, in many ways, how the Uyghur situation is resolved. That is, if the Uyghurs being liberated from China could lead to the liberation of all Central Asia. It's always been my gut level feeling that this is kind of the test case. That it goes well beyond, the implications of this go well beyond just the Uyghur people, and go to the history of the entire, to the fate of the entire region to a great extent. if you collectively look at Central Asia, it doesn't have to be constantly giving in to the Chinese or the Russian interests. Okay, it doesn't have to be, and I would like to see, I suppose I'd like to see America play a more forward role. Excuse me, in this going forward. Now that's not an easy case to make, and there are plenty of I understand that regional specialists always feel this way about their region. Okay, but nonetheless, regional specialists may feel that way, but most regional specialists haven't looked at a base like the one I did. Okay, that's a very disturbing element. It is right on the border. It is right on the right, less than 100 feet from the border. It's enormous. Okay, huge assets. Uh, and right now, there could be no response. I mean, there would be no American response. And the only thing stopping them is maybe they don't want to annoy the Russians too much. Right? Just speculation on my part is that the Chinese are moving slow, not fast. But we don't know how long that's going to last. So I just mentioned this because I thought that this was an important point of the book, but I'm genuinely sad about it because of all the investigations that we did. This was the one where nothing really could emerge. Well, it won't emerge from the ICC anyways. So now I look to the State Department, I look to the Pentagon, this is where I look to. I look to the big boys to do something here.
That being said, we're about to run out of time, so I just want to finally ask one last question. At the event at the Hudson Institute earlier this week, there were talks about, passing the Stop Organ Harvesting Act, which has passed the House, and hopefully, there are, hopefully it'll pass the Senate as well. But governments over the past, at least for the past 5 years, have condemned, including the United States government, the genocide against Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples. There's been condemnations, against specific elements of the atrocities as well. Yet nothing has really been effectively done. And one key thing that you made, statement that you made was, all of this is not going to be, enough to stop Beijing,
Yep.
and you said that, something else might be. And so if you could
Sure. I mean,
tell us
what I'm
exactly
getting exactly
what would actually take to end these
well, I
atrocities.
think that's the point. The point is we can cut off relations, medical relations with China, and I think that will help matters. Uh, but I don't think it's really going to stop them from continuing this. Not really. There's a lot of profit based on this, and the Chinese are not going to get they'd like to be the king of the pharmaceutical world, but that's not going to happen right now, especially after COVID and all the bad associations people have with Chinese medical practices right now. We have to get anywhere with this. We must increase the stakes for Beijing. We must just push the stakes up to a place where they don't really want to bet anymore. And the best way to do that is to just simply acknowledge the obvious. The obvious is this. I mean, you look at when peoples have really been threatened, their survival has been threatened, not just slavery, not just forced labor, but their actual survival has been threatened. Ireland with the potato famine, Ukraine with the famine that was really engineered by Russia, right? By the Russians or by Moscow, you might say. Uh, and of course, the Jews in the gas chambers, and that's what led to Israel. And you know, you look at this and you say, well, how do these states come back to life? Well, they come back to life when they're at these kinds of conditions. And this is absolutely true with the Uyghurs. They are not the Falun Gong. Falun Gong must, you know, push a boulder up. To change China, they have to push a boulder up every night and then see it topple down in the morning sometimes. Okay, that is their fate because they love China, they love the Chinese people, and they hate the Communist Party. The Uyghurs do not have to love the Chinese people. there's no reason for them to love or hopefully even hate the Chinese people or anything. The point is and the organ harvesting is what seals the deal for me here. This is a direct threat to existence. Direct. I mean, if China goes to war with Taiwan, all bets are off. The entire Uyghur population could be put to death by a single virus that's been engineered over the years very quickly. Okay, and it could all look kind of like an accident. We don't have to use gas chambers or anything like that anymore. So I think this is the point. This is how we increase the pressure. We acknowledge that the, Uyghur nationalism is a valid idea, that we support it. We can't say how we'll get from A to B. We don't have to spell that out. We just have to say that we support it at this point. And that would be pushing the envelope. It would be upping the stakes. Now, Beijing, I'm sure it'll be uncomfortable. But if Beijing really, wants to continue to play this game, find a new victim group, okay, at least. Do something. But stop doing this to the Uyghurs. And that would be one way to present it. I don't mean to think the tactical elements here. But I believe that it's often politics is just a question of stating the obvious. Okay, that's often what it is, and this is such a case. The Uyghur people have the right to independence at this point, no question about it.
Thank you. That being said, I apologize for cutting you off, but we are running. We are a little bit over the time limit. And that being said, Ethan, firstly, on behalf of the East Turkistan government in exile, and mostly on behalf of the Uyghur, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and other Turkic people, including all those whose name that we may never know, especially the hundreds of thousands of victims of this mass murder via organ harvesting. We want to thank you. Thank you for, going where others wouldn't go. Thank you for exposing the truth. And thank you for, trying to get, some action and, justice for our people. With that being said, we also want to thank everyone who joined us live today. We, again, encourage you to find the book Xinjiang Procedure on Amazon. The link is, again, in the description. And we hope that you will share it with others, that you will read it, you will share it with others, and that that this will ultimately motivate you to act in any capacity that you can to end these atrocities. Thank you again, and with that, until our next episode, we thank you for joining us.